So today we get to talk about the very fascinating world of church governance, okay? And so if we go to the next slide, church governance throughout the centuries has sort of had different iterations, and there's a spectrum, right? You have the very centralized Catholic Church where a lot of the big decisions come from a small body. And as much as we like to criticize that sort of model, my brother actually pointed something out to me that made me think, because he's Catholic, and he told me this. He said, no matter where I go on any given Sunday to any Catholic church, it could be a Catholic church in Taipei, Catholic church where he lives in Cincinnati, Catholic church in LA, I can be sure that the sermon verses are the same and that the songs are similar, right? And so there's this uniformity that he can know, even though he's not at his home church, he will still experience with his home church sort of the same message, the same sort of flow. And then, in reaction to the megachurch movement, you have what's called the emergent church, which is more modern, a little bit more focused on organic church, very toned down, not a lot of production. Okay, but the problem with that is they don't really like centralized authority, so it becomes so decentralized that unfortunately the emergent church movement has really fallen into bad theology, in a sense. And somewhere in the middle, you sort of have this more distributive leadership. The Presbyterian churches is like that, where there's a governance of elders that prescribe the direction of the church and oversee the church. And so which model is best, you know? And many people will talk about the early church as the model that God told us to follow for all eternity. That if we want to know what church is supposed to look like, you look at Acts, and that's the model for what church is supposed to be like for the next 2,000 to 3,000 years. Okay? But I think when you approach the Bible, we have to be really careful about understanding what's descriptive, meaning it's just there to explain something that happened. You don't necessarily need to follow it, it just happened. And what's prescriptive, what God intends us to actually follow. So there's descriptive and there's prescriptive, right? And so let's look at a passage that we've been kind of dancing around that seems to hint a lot about what church governance could look like, and that's Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And this had to do with the widows. In these days, when the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint by the Hellenists, so this is more the Greek, the non-Hebrews, the Gentiles, against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. So there was a bit of a divide, the Jews and the non-Jews. The non-Jews are saying, you're not taking care of our widows. They're not getting the daily distribution, maybe of food as needed. And the 12 summoned the full number of disciples and said, it is not right that we should get of preaching the word of God to serve tables. Therefore, brothers, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we will appoint to this duty. We will devote ourselves to prayer and to ministry of the word. This is the first time we sort of see a structure in the church. And in simple terms, there is this division of labor that's happening in the early church. And one of it has to do with there's a group who devote themselves to prayer and teaching, if we go to the next slide. And then there's a group whose job it is more to maintain the physical operation, to keep the church going, and some of the ministries, specifically the ministries to the widows. And so there's no terms given in Acts 6, but later in the New Testament, these terms begin to get more developed, and the way that these are called is, the first group is called usually elders, but there's also the term overseers in the Bible, pastors, bishops, and shepherds. Those all seem to be the same thing. And then there's this term deacons, who are more concerned with the physical operations of the church, okay? And whether churches know it or not, they have these positions, okay? Whether they know it or not, they have these positions. They just might call them the wrong thing or something different, right? There are churches that sometimes what they call deacons or what they call church staff, those are actually more in the role of elders. Because if we go to the next slide, they're in charge of spiritual direction. Okay, so church staff sometimes includes pastors or deacons in certain churches actually set spiritual direction. So they're actually more elders. And there's other people they might call it volunteers, or they give them some different name. Ministry leaders, those are actually more of the deacons who are also caring for the church members. So no matter what a church says, These roles exist. Whatever they name them, these roles actually exist. And it seems really like a simple distinction, right? Like, oh, this is what elders do, this is what deacons do, and you read the Bible, here are the qualifications of elders, and here are the qualifications of deacons. But I want to point out that there's actually a lot of disagreement in how to interpret what these roles mean in the church and how they are lived out, okay? And so I'm just going to use the Baptists and the Presbyterians. This is overly simplified, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's important to know of where they disagree. Okay, so from the Baptist role, elders just play an advisory role, and then they come to the congregation and they ask the congregation to vote or to make a decision about some item on the agenda. Where they get this, or one way you can see this, is in Matthew chapter 18, which was about confronting the person who is essentially sort of in sin. And right, you confront them, then you come with one or two witnesses, and then you bring them to the leaders, the elders, and then you bring them to the church. And it says this: if he refuses to listen, tell it to the church, and if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. So in other words, the church gets to decide to kick the member out. Okay, so the elders just make a recommendation. Here's the situation. The church votes and decides what to do with that. We see it in Acts 6, right? Who decides who gets to be the deacons? The church, right? The disciples or the apostles, the 12, even though they're in the leadership position, they're not the ones that picked the 12 to serve. It was actually the church that made the decision. And if you look in Corinthians, when there was that man allowed to live in sin, or in other verses where false teaching enters into the church, who gets blamed? Not the elders, the church. So the Baptists believe that the elders are there as an advisor to the church, but ultimately the congregation is held responsible for the decision-making and sort of the spiritual direction of the group as the whole. Presbyterians, on the other hand, if we go to the next slide, believe that elders actually have the final say. So the way Presbyterian churches typically work is within the local church, there are elders, and they make decisions. But actually, above the local church is a regional board of elders, and they can make decisions that affect the local church without the local church having any sort of say. So these are sort of the different ways that eldership is lived out. Okay, but there's also disagreement about the roles of elders and the types of elders that revolve around 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17. It says, "Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor." Look at this. "Especially those who labor in preaching and teaching." So, the Presbyterian Church makes a distinction between elders who teach and preach and elders who just rule. If we could go to the next verse, right? Or the next slide. So the Presbyterian churches, they distinguish. Here's an elder who teaches, because what does the verse say? There's these people that deserve double honor. Why do they deserve double honor? Because they're different. Why are they different? Because they preach and teach. The Baptists believe that there's no distinction and that elders are just elders. And in fact, the Baptists believe all elders should be able to teach, right? Because there's verses for that. So who's right? I don't know. There's also a case to be made for the Presbyterian case, because if you look at the early Corinthian church, Paul was the main teacher, and none of the other elders in the early Corinthian church were really teaching. Maybe because they were not able to, maybe because they were not trained. But there was a leadership situation in early Corinth where there was a special elder, Paul, who was the planter in a sense, or there in the early stages. He was the main teacher and preacher, and you have the other elders who were just more in charge of the spiritual leadership. So there's that disagreement, okay? But from a bird's eye view, because it is complicated, and again, you have to decide what's prescriptive and what's descriptive. Let's just say this, that the elders, God sets aside certain members of the church body to pray and teach, and those are elders, and God sets certain members aside that are more focused on the physical aspects of running the church, and those would be called deacons, okay? Let's just kind of go with that. So I was tasked by the board a few months ago to talk about our church structure. So I'm just going to kind of take you briefly through a story of how we got to where we are. And it's not overly detailed, but here we go. Okay, so when Pastor Alex came in, there was a deacon board created, and the deacon board worked with the pastor, okay? And then there was a group called POMAC, I could never remember the acronym, or what it means, okay? But the POMAC also worked with the pastor, and they sort of played separate roles. And over time, it was really confusing to me, but based on ongoing conversations and incidents that happened, here's what it became clear. If we can go to the next slide, okay? So the diaconate board was actually in charge more with prayer and teaching of the word. Why? Because Pastor was in it and Leo was in it, right? We were the main preachers and teachers of the word. The diaconate board was also meant to set spiritual direction. There were times where we brought sort of little nuts and bolts items to the deacon board, and it's like, that's not what the deacon board is. We're supposed to set the overall spiritual direction. POMAC was meant to do the ministry, welcoming, what else? Maybe missions. There's all sorts of other ministries that we needed, right? So that's how we were set up, okay? So what I came to realize is these are very misnamed because the deacon board, if we go to the next slide, were really fulfilling the roles of what the Bible called elders. And POMAC was really fulfilling the role of what the Bible would refer to as deacons, okay? So there was sort of a misnomer. Okay, and then things went crazy, and because we're a small church, here's what it actually looks like. Okay, so currently the diaconate board, as we named it, should we rename it? I don't know, actually does a little bit of everything, right? So the diaconate board does pray and set the spiritual direction, but the diaconate board also has to deal with things like mold, okay, or giving to missions, and all these little nuts and bolts, the budgeting, all that, okay? So right now, we're a small church, right? That's sort of where the diaconate board is. Where it's sort of heading, if we could go to the next slide, is more like this, right? So the diaconate board, until we rename it, is still in charge of prayer, teaching, a little bit of the decision-making, a little bit of missions, a little bit of facilities. But now we've sort of have these people that have stepped up into ministry leads, right? People that are in charge of fellowship, children's music. And so now the board can serve more as an advisor or as a support to those ministries. Okay, and then members, from time to time, have to vote on certain decisions, right? And what those decisions are all spelled out somewhere. I don't want to get into it because it's confusing to me too. Okay, so that's our church structure. Okay, small church, so everything gets muddled up. Okay, where we're heading, we'll have to wait and see. Okay, so that's sort of the nuts and bolts. So what the heck does this have to do with us? So just a couple reminders. Okay. Number one, I just want to remind us that these structures exist because God always provides his people with shepherds. Always. Think of your life. Think of your Christian journey up to this point. Did God not always provide you, not all the time, but at least at key points or key seasons with a shepherd? I want us to really think about those people that God strategically placed for that time in your life to act as a shepherd, to act as a spiritual guide, to act as accountability. God always provides his people with shepherds. Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 15 says, I will give you shepherds after my own heart who will feed you with knowledge and understanding. He promises to give you shepherds. He promises to provide people in our lives, in our church, who have his heart, who will feed us with knowledge and understanding. Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 4, I will set shepherds over them who will care for them, and they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed, neither shall any be missing, declares the Lord, right? God shows his love in some ways through the provision of shepherds that give guidance, that provide care, that help sort of alleviate fear, that bring people back into the fold if they're missing, right? God gives us individually and as a church those shepherds. And I hope you would just take some time this week to just Maybe pray for those shepherds that he has brought in your life, because he knows we need guidance. We do. He knows we need encouragement. He knows we need accountability. No matter how long you've been at this, no matter how old or seasoned you feel as a Christian, you need shepherding. And so I was just thinking, do we need like an actual pastor? Yes. And I believe God wants to provide that type of shepherd. Also want us to be reminded that church leadership, at least in Acts, was always meant to be a plurality. It was always meant to be a plurality. Because it's really when you have different personalities coming together and working together that we display to the world the unity of God. And God's full character is always displayed more in plurality than it is in individuality. That's why, I mean, this isn't quite related, but if you think about the shepherds God provides, right? He provided priests, then he provided a judge, and then when did they get into trouble? Or provided judges. When did they get into trouble? Single king, right? And I know there was other reasons for that. Single king, then we get into trouble. Okay? Not that the judges were all great, but God's image through the microcosm of a church is best displayed through plurality, right? And I look at our board, and I'm so glad that there are different personalities. There are some of us that are really good at in-the-moment decision-making and crisis management. Oh, something's happening, here's how we deal with that. There are other people on the board who are much better with vision setting and long-term thinking. Okay, I'm not going to tell you which one I am. Okay, but I'm really glad for that balance, right? And I just see how God brings the different parts of the body together, right? Because any sort of leadership structure, even if you have a pastor or not, is really meant to supplement the pastor's gifts and weaknesses, but also their judgment. And lastly, I just want to close with Acts 6 again. What did the elders devote themselves to? 6 verse 4. It says, we will devote ourselves to prayer and to ministry of the word. Okay? Prayer and ministry of the word. We're not going to devote ourselves to making sure the church has enough finances. We're not going to devote ourselves to making sure this mission team goes off without any trouble. We're going to devote ourselves to two things, prayer and teaching of the word. But the very first thing they mentioned was prayer. So here's my last point. Right? Prayer is foundational to leading a church. Prayer is foundational to leading a church. I have no doubts that some of these people were gifted in leadership. I have no doubts that there are some people that were gifted in management, that were gifted in organization, that were gifted in being motivational. I have no doubts that there are people that were charismatic. Right? But we cannot base church leadership on those things, but instead prayer. Because what is prayer? Prayer is humbling ourselves and coming to total dependence on God for guidance and provision. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 says this, let no one deceive himself. If anyone amongst you thinks he is wise in this age, let him become a fool that he may become wise. Verse 19. For the wisdom of this world is folly with God. I am sure there are times at this church and in any other church and in our lives where the decision seems obvious. Of course I'm going to do this. That's the most logical thing to do. Of course we're going to move in this direction because that's the way to fix this problem, or that's the way that's the most prosperous. I'm sure we receive advice that seems really wise for the moment. We think, yeah, of course, any rational person would do that thing. But beware, because the wisdom of the world sometimes contradicts the wisdom of God. And to the world, sometimes God's direction and wisdom seems foolish. But the reality is, it's the world's wisdom, the world's direction, that is actually foolishness. So that's where prayer comes in. It's this healthy understanding that we don't know what's best, even though we have experience, training, qualifications, and we're pretty smart. Prayer is this act of admitting, I don't know what's best for me, and in the leadership setting, I don't necessarily know what's best direction for the church. So I'm going to ask you, God. Look at Acts chapter 1. This had to do with replacing Judas. Here's what it says. And they prayed and said, you, Lord, who know the hearts of all, show which one of these two you have chosen to take place in this ministry and apostleship, from which Judas turned aside to go to his own place. And they cast lots for them, and the lot fell to Matthias, and he was numbered. Okay. What were they admitting? They're admitting there are these two people. We might have a clear winner. I don't know. Maybe this person is the most qualified for certain reasons. I don't know, but look at what they said. They came, they prayed. Why? They prayed because it's God who knows the heart. It's God who knows what's best. Human eyes might tell us something different, but God knows what's best. And I don't actually agree with this. I think casting lots was actually the wrong thing to do. I think, this is just my thinking, that maybe when we read this, the Bible's meant for us to read that and go, what the heck? They prayed and cast lots? And I know that happens other times. I think, and this is just speculation, so you don't have to believe this, they should have waited. I think they should have waited. I think they should have prayed and waited. Waited until what? I think they should have waited till there was unanimous decision. Okay, there are some churches I know that operate according to that belief, that that church does not move forward until the elder board in prayer all unanimously agrees that this is God's direction and will. It takes longer to get things done. It's less agile, and in some ways it's dangerous, but it's that heart of humility saying, God, we don't want to move forward just to deal with the situation. We want to move forward because you tell us to move forward. And that could get abused, but that's just my thing, right? But I love it because there's this mistrust of their own wisdom, this healthy paranoia that I'm not going to trust my eyes. I'm not going to trust just my experience, although God could use that, but I'm going to come and trust God. We see that again lastly here in Acts 15, and what was happening is these people were telling Gentile Christians they have to do all these Jewish things to be truly followers of Christ, right? Which upset a lot of the Gentiles. And here's what the apostles decided. We have therefore sent Judas and Silas, who themselves will tell you the same thing by word of mouth. Verse 28, for it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay on you no greater burden than these requirements, right? And they list it out. So why did they send these two? They sent these two first, and behind the scenes, probably through prayer, and not because it seemed good to us. A lot of times we make decisions because it seems good to us, like that's the obvious choice, but because the Holy Spirit led them in that direction. Church leadership, and I would say our life decisions, should be founded on prayer. So here's the truth. Not everyone is called to be an elder, but I will challenge us with this. Could we step in for a moment into that role? Because I think everyone is called to pray. So we're going to do things a little differently, okay? So rather than engage in awkward conversations, no, they're not awkward. I'm going to actually just ask us to spend more time praying. And I'll give a specific prayer request, okay? So if we could put that up. So in the groups, in a moment, I'm going to ask us to pray for these things. The spiritual health of our church members, right? The definition of a member is someone who's committed to being present here. And part of being present is, I think, being present in the lives, and part of that is prayer. I want you to pray for Aaron, right? I want you to pray for Zoe, right? Jake and Carissa, just church members that God brings to your heart in your groups, okay? Please pray for the board, right? We need God's guidance and direction. I think we're slowly entering into phase 3, which is more the future, okay? Slowly getting there. Pray for guidance about our future pastor. We're not in a rush, but at the same time, we need God's guidance. And also, I challenge you to pray for Daniel's mission and vision trip, which he's going to share about in a moment, so you're clear on what that is. And I also want to challenge us this. Take a moment every day this week, just to pray for our church, right? Just to pray for our church. So we don't leave it to just the elder or deacon board or whatever. We don't just leave it to a pastor, but we, this week, every day, pray for our church. So I'm going to ask Daniel to come up and share about the opportunities, and then we'll get in our groups and share and pray.
Okay. All right. Oh, oops. Thanks, Leo, for the opportunity for me to share. Just really challenged by the message today. I want to start with that because I think for me, I'm more inclined to move ahead of God, and God sort of like has to always sort of discipline me. And I think it's part of the reason why I think my life has different challenges. It's more so it always feels like God's like asking me to stop and pray and just pray. And so I'm really challenged by today's message. And so I think with that in mind, I wanted to share. Like this week I'm leaving for Thailand, kind of along the northern border. I'm going with Green Arc, and I just had a chance to kind of reflect a little bit about like why I'm going this time. And I have nothing to prove. There's nothing that I want from it. I think honestly, just if I had to be really raw and real with you guys, I'm going just because I really feel like the gospel compels me to go. I feel like God in His mercy and kindness and love loved me enough to show His love to me at some point in my life, to show my sinfulness, and that's why I want to go. And I know there's a need for sure. But I think there's I think it's for me it's all about faithfulness. So it's not about what I'm gonna do or whatever. It's just I just need to be faithful. And so I think just pray for me, for actually Manana is gonna go too. He doesn't know the details yet, but but we'll talk about it later today. And I'm excited because, I feel like in 10 years, right, there's going to be someone there in Thailand that wouldn't have ever had the same opportunities. And it doesn't matter if they don't ever know that, we were the ones that went to build up that structure, to support them, to give them just like food, right? Like right now, all they need is just food, and before they even receive the good word of God. And so it doesn't really matter to me that they don't know who went and who supported them, because I don't care about the recognition. I just want that person to know that someone out there cared for them. But even more so, I want them to know that God is crazy about them, and that somehow their lives were meant for something a lot bigger. And so just pray for that. All these kids, they don't even have names. They don't even know their birthday. And so I picked out a song, we'll close later, that just God just kind of showed me. And I told Victoria I want to sing that song to the kids, that He knows their names. So pray for me, pray for Manana. Pray that we would just be faithful. Pray that we would find the right people to build a more long-term thing, because obviously we're not going to go, every year. And so I think there's more to do I think if there's people locally who can support the mission there. But whatever God has for us, pray for that. And then I think I also have a job to really just pray, because I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just being faithful and going. So, yep.
All right, can we put up the prayers again? So take some time, share prayer requests, personal prayer requests, but do make sure that we as a church pray for these things, all right? So let's gather together and pray, church.